Taiwan and China have both depended on relations with African countries for global diplomatic recognition. Mao Zedong is reported to have said, "It is our African brothers who have carried us into the UN." The history of Africa-China cooperation during the era of decolonization remains one important source of legitimacy for contemporary Africa-China relations. For people in Taiwan, however, the tragic other side of the story was the removal of Taiwan from the UN. However, there is a related history of Taiwan-Africa relations which is largely invisible in Taiwan. During the 1990s, Taiwan even used economic aid to encourage multiple countries to recognize Taiwan. Since the 2000s, however, China has reversed these gains from a brief peak of 10 diplomatic partners in Africa to the present situation where only Eswatini maintains formal diplomatic relations. There are many factors explaining why different African countries that previously recognized Taiwan would choose to break ties and recognize China. One motivation, of course, is access to financing, investment, trade, and aid. Since the 2000s, China has become one of the continent's most significant economic partners. For Taiwan, Africa remains largely invisible, while relations between China and Africa continue to deepen on not just the state-to-state level, but also the level of people-to-people relations. The purpose of this study is twofold. The first is to evaluate, on the African side, the assumption that a closer diplomatic relationship with China translates into improved economic performance. The second is to explore, on the Taiwan side, how Taiwanese business and civil society actors have promoted informal relations between Taiwan and African countries in the absence of state-to-state ties. Regarding the first question, does switching ties from Taiwan to China translate into greater economic performance? This study comes to several conclusions. The first is that establishing a diplomatic relationship with China does not automatically translate into overall economic growth. The reason is simply that increased aid, financing, investment, and trade with China are not the only factors affecting economic performance. For example, Malawi was a long-time diplomatic partner of Taiwan. When it broke ties in 2008 in order to establish ties with China, there were high expectations promoted by the government that relations with China would improve Malawi's economic situation. However, Malawi's overall economic growth did not seem to improve with statistical significance in at least the 6 years following. What happened? Well, let's look at trade. On the one hand, Malawi's exports to China increased, doubling between 2007 and 2010. However, the volume of Malawi's imports from China increased even more. In other words, the act of recognizing China may help a country's exporters, but with the exception of major oil exporting countries like Angola, the trade pattern for most African countries has been to run a large trade deficit with China. What about FDI? Chinese financing and infrastructure and FDI in manufacturing are frequently argued to be the sectors where China is making a difference. And one can point to the fact that Chinese imports include capital goods like machinery, in addition to the consumer goods that dominate markets across the continent. However, as of at least 2022, despite widespread agendas for promoting industrialization, most African economies have yet to cross a threshold of what political economists call structural transformation. That is, breaking the pattern of unequal structural dependency on wealthier industrial economies in the global north or China. For example, Chinese FDI to Malawi increased after 2008, but judging from World Bank data, the overall contribution of industry to Malawi's GDP has hovered generally at 15% since 2001. Finally, there were other factors affecting Malawi's economic growth. For example, in 2011, several Western donors suspended aid to Malawi's government. At the time, 40% of Malawi's national budget was dependent on Western aid. During the anti-government protests which broke out during the subsequent economic crisis, Chinese traders, whose numbers also increased after 2008, became one of the targets of popular protest. There have also been subsequent debates in Malawi about whether it was worth it to switch. While officials can point to specific projects, many ordinary people may point out, as one journalist did, Malawi is still poor. Why is all this significant? Because expectations that closer relations with China alone will structurally transform an economy sets the stage for politically consequential disappointments. The second part of this story moves beyond the contest for diplomatic relations, looking at how Taiwanese business and civil society actors have promoted informal relations between Taiwan and African countries in the absence of government-to-government ties. It is important to recognize that China's success in winning African support in the UN has not just been based on government-to-government ties, but also people-to-people relations. For example, China is a top destination for African students. Chinese migrants to Africa are another factor. It is probably little known in Taiwan, however, that it was often individual Taiwanese who established themselves in several African countries before people from the PRC. For example, there were once 50,000 to 70,000 Taiwanese in South Africa during the 1990s. In several other African countries, the earliest leaders of the Chinese business community were actually Taiwanese. These countries, like Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, or Tanzania, are countries which never formally recognized Taiwan. In these countries, and other countries like Cameroon, Taiwanese, while outnumbered by their Chinese counterparts, remain present economically and socially. In countries that used to recognize Taiwan, like Malawi, Taiwanese business people, NGOs, and hospitals have continued to operate businesses, projects, and social enterprises. And more recently, younger Taiwanese have established ties with Africa through NGOs and religious organizations. The scope of their activities is not limited to Taiwan's past or present diplomatic partners. African students from countries close to China have also come to Taiwan through initiatives of universities and also foreign NGOs. Other organizations, like Well Africa, have established media platforms designed to improve knowledge about Africa in Taiwan. Furthermore, organizations like the Taiwan-Africa Business Association and the Africa-Taiwan Economic Forum continue to organize regular trade delegations and investment-related seminars. The important point to emphasize is that private Taiwanese actors have greater freedom and mobility to build connections, including with African governments, than does Taiwan's government. In particular, many African governments welcome actors who can bring investment and training regardless of where they may come from. However, Taiwan's government could do more to support such economic and social connections through providing subsidies to businesses so that they're more willing to venture out and take risks. They could also increase support for NGO-led initiatives and for educational and academic exchanges, which promotes greater understanding about Africa in Taiwan. The important message is that the quality of economic and grassroots people-to-people relations between Taiwan and African countries plays a greater role in the maintenance and enhancement of Taiwan-Africa ties than may be acknowledged by a traditional emphasis on diplomatic relations. Therefore, it is in Taiwan's interest to promote these relations anywhere it can and to delink them from the status of diplomatic relations. For example, relying on ties with governments alone can be vulnerable if there is a change in leadership. However, relying on private sector initiatives alone also cannot be romanticized. For example, private recruitment of overseas students for private universities is an area which needs close oversight to prevent abuses. Finally, the policy of suspending scholarships for students from diplomatic partners after diplomatic breaks should be reconsidered. Even if Taiwan may be disappointed with the government, if it shows benevolence to the students, these students may continue to be friends of Taiwan in that country in the future. They may not only be customers and business partners for Taiwan's companies, but also potential voices in that country on Taiwan's behalf. While it is unlikely that Taiwan might create a lobby for re-establishing formal diplomatic ties, creating a group of people friendly to Taiwan may help Taiwan in other ways. It is important to remember that most people in Africa, like elsewhere, don't understand the nuances of the China-Taiwan conflict. If they do, their understanding is filtered primarily through how they feel about China versus the West. Promoting people-to-people relations creates the conditions of possibility for ordinary Africans to hear Taiwan's story from ordinary Taiwanese themselves, and for ordinary Taiwanese to hear African stories from ordinary Africans themselves.